and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine, Israel. I'm Mark Hage. In a recent interview with Jacobin magazine, Omar Bartov, a distinguished professor of genocide and Holocaust studies at Brown University and an Israeli Jewish citizen, had this to say about the struggles of his profession, of his fellow historians, with what is unfolding in Gaza today. He said, quote, "Think about what's happening now in Gaza and how the historical profession has struggled to respond. It has been especially difficult for scholars of the subdiscipline of Holocaust studies to write about or even engage with what is happening in Gaza. It has been impossible for most Holocaust scholars to square that circle. They have either tried to avoid it altogether, or even worse, have joined the chorus heard in Germany and the United States and Israel, asserting that what Hamas did was not just a massacre and a crime, but comparable to the Holocaust. And therefore, the only possible response is total destruction. In other words, the supposed answer to a perceived genocide is genocide, which is exactly the wrong lesson to take from the Holocaust." Fellow historian Raz Siegel, also a professor of genocide and Holocaust studies at Stockton University, would agree with Dr. Bartov. He was the first serious academic to label what Israel is doing in Gaza, quote, is a textbook case of genocide, and he did so in 2023. Last month, Dr. Siegel sat down for a conversation with Mohammed Hashim, the host of Real Talk, a show produced by Middle East Eye. And in that program, he discussed the intense backlash faced by Jewish scholars who dare to question Israel or to call what it's doing in Gaza as a genocide. He discusses also the implications for international law and human rights of the complicity of Western powers in Israel's crimes against humanity, the weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence dissent, and the impact on his career of speaking out as he did in 2023. He also contextualized Israel's action in Gaza as part of a decades-long settler colonial project with the objective of seizing as much territory as possible with as few Palestinian Arabs on that land as possible. We'll show you as much of this interview as time permits. Here now is Dr. Raz Siegel, professor of genocide and Holocaust studies at Stockton University.
Remember that immediately after 7th of October, Israeli Jews and lawmakers, right, were talking about a second Nakba, positively, not denying the Nakba, calling for a second Nakba. From the moment that Israel is created, there's this idea that it is unimaginable that it can perpetrate really any crime under international law, let alone genocide.
But isn't it ironic that you would be called an anti-Semite for saying something like that?
We have to be clear. There's no other way, there's no engaging in this absurd argument. Anti-Zionist Jews are not anti-Semites.
Is this why you've said the project of Israel as a security project for Jews has failed, not only in Israel, but all over the world?
Absolutely. Israeli Jews are admitting that what they're doing is in the frame of an Israeli settler colonial violence, right? That is the greater Israel idea since 1948. Maximum territory, minimum Palestinians.
Dr. Raz Siegel is a prominent Israeli-American scholar and the associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. He was the first academic voice to label Israel's war on Gaza a textbook case of genocide in 2023. But that also came with a price. The University of Minnesota later rescinded a job offer to him over his comments. So today we'll speak to him not only about his background and personal experience, but also about his decision to call it a genocide in 2023. And he joins us now from Philadelphia. Dr. Raz Siegel, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Real Talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Professor, we're going to delve into a few things this conversation. I think the starting point is really what's been a major talking point the last, 16, 17 months or so. You've called Gaza a textbook case of genocide. Now, firstly, how does one get there with conviction?
Well, it is actually, it is constantly important to restate the argument And the argument for genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza from the very beginning, that is, really immediately after the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, and to remind people of the evidence for this argument. And it's important because of two things. One, two related things. One is that it's constantly questioned, this argument. I mean, sometimes it's even questioned that that there's any crimes under international law in Israel's attack on Gaza. But of course, the fact that we are witnessing a case of genocide is constantly questioned. And it's questioned, and this is the second thing, in the broader frame of Nakba denial. Because we really have to understand Israel's attack on Gaza is an integral part of an ongoing Nakba, of an Israeli settler colonial assault on Palestinians since the 1948 Nakba. And if we actually talk about settler colonialism, Zionist settler colonialism, then we actually have to start before 1948 and the 1948 Nakba, but at the very least, since the 1948 Nakba. So there's the broader frame of Nakba denial that is unfortunately structural in Israel and in the West since 1948, right? And has become very much operative, that is, after October 2023. So Nakba denial, and then the continuous questioning and denial of genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza. So let's, very briefly, why did I write this piece, basically, on the 13th of October, 2023? How so soon after 7th of October, right? These are the kind of questions that people ask. Sometimes they're framed, in a very accusatory tone. How dare you?
You were one of the first to do it.
Yeah, I think I was actually the first, but so here are some of the issues and also some of the evidence. First of all, I want to remind everyone that I'm a Jewish scholar of the Holocaust and of the Jewish world. I grew up with grandparents who, went through and survived World War II and the Holocaust in Bulgaria and in Romania. And I've been studying and teaching and writing about the Holocaust and about more broadly about genocide. If we take the starting point, say, the time when I was a master's student back in Tel Aviv University in Israel, then it's more than 20 years now. And one of the things that that in a way motivated me to, pursue a career in this field, right, is the idea that it should be possible, right, to prevent genocide. Okay? Now, I know this sounds perhaps idealistic, right, or naive, but that's genuinely part of the reason that I decided to do a master's, go on to do a PhD, and work, that is, conduct research and teach and write, and work in this field, Holocaust and genocide studies. We might want to go back and explore this title of the field at some point, but
we will. No, we will definitely.
So genocide prevention is based on the idea and on the practice that we don't just recognize genocide after it happened, and after it's complete, right? Genocide prevention is precisely based on the idea that we learn from the history of genocide, that we learn from the history of the Holocaust, right? What is that dictum, never again, if not that, right? That we know that there are various indicators that tell us that genocide, that there's a significant danger for genocide, that perhaps genocide has started to unfold, right? And then we can, there are perhaps all kinds of things that we can do on all kinds of levels, right? The international level, national levels, civil society, so on and so forth, to stop it, to prevent it, right? So that is one way to think about why I wrote what I wrote on the 13th of October. Now, that is when people say, well, wasn't it too early to raise the alarm? No, it wasn't, right? Why wasn't it?
Mhm.
Because we were all hearing and seeing and witnessing explicit statements of what's called in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948, the UN Genocide Convention, explicit statements of intent to destroy a group, that is Palestinians, as such in the language of the convention.
And Professor, you're referring to what Israeli officials like Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, when he said we're fighting human animals, when other lawmakers said that there are no innocents in Gaza, when Netanyahu invoked the Amalek as well.
So we've been here, Israel's war minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, right? And I insist on referring to him as war minister rather than defense minister, right? On the 9th of October already, he told us very clearly that Israel is imposing a total siege, right? We have to remember this is following a 16-year siege on Gaza, where Israel calculated the calories that Palestinians will be able, should be able to eat, controlled, the air, sea, land borders, right? The longest siege in modern history, 16 years. Now Gallant was telling us that he's imposing a total siege, right? Total siege that is total, right? We don't. There's the statements that we heard, right? That Palestinians are human animals, that Israel is imposing a total siege that is on every, there is no difference between combatants, civilians, right? This key differentiation in international law and the law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war. No, everyone, no fuel, no food, no medical supplies, no nothing, right? And then at the same time, we were already seeing, right, intentionally indiscriminate bombings of Gaza, okay, where Israeli military, senior Israeli officers in the Israeli army, lawmakers, as you said, Israeli leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, we're talking about the fact that the aim is, maximum damage, right? They were telling us this in plain language, right? And then came the 13th of October. And what happened on the 13th of October? Israel's first quote unquote evacuation order. Okay. This is the day when I published a piece in Jewish Kurds. Why is this very, very significant in the argument and evidence for genocide? Because Israel was telling more than 1 million Palestinians to move from the northern part of Gaza to the southern part of Gaza in the way that Israel decided what is north and what is south in Gaza. It's interesting, by the way, that people have started to use this, separation of northern Gaza, southern Gaza, which is, of course, an Israeli construct, right? But on 13th of October, Israel was telling more than million people to move immediately, right? But they weren't just telling them to move immediately. They were telling them to move immediately under conditions of total siege, following 16 years of siege. So we know because they were sending text messages and voice messages that they were already feeling the effects of the total siege very much in those first few days after 7th of October. I'm not even talking about hospitals, people who are sick, people who cannot move, pregnant women, babies, children, the elderly, so on and so forth, right? But also under intentionally indiscriminate bombings of everything.
Yeah, and a lot of these safety zones or safety routes were being bombed as well.
Exactly. So and we know, I mean, even the New York Times later in December 2023, right, in a big investigative piece, right, showed everyone who cared that Israel was using the most destructive US-made bombs, the 2,000-ton bombs, is specifically in the south, where it had, instructed Palestinians to flee from the north, specifically on the routes that Israel has designated as safe routes, right? And we know, actually, again, because Palestinians were sending voice messages and text messages immediately after 7th of October. So we have these kinds of testimonies, basically, that the bombings in the safe zones, quote unquote, were so severe that in some cases, Palestinians who had fled south decided to flee back to the north because they decided that they have more chances of survival there rather than in the south. So the evacuation order, quote unquote, as later, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory since 1967. Later, she called it in her report humanitarian camouflage, right? So the use of safe zones in international humanitarian law, not in order to protect civilians, which is their function in international law, but actually in order to enhance the targeting of civilians, right? Which is what Israel actually did, right? This was, again, accompanied by explicit statements, and not one or two. And as you said, it wasn't just in the heat of the moment after October 7th, of the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. It was in the weeks, in the month. We're still hearing anyone who follows the Israeli media, right? And is following the Israeli press, the Hebrew language press, has been exposed in the last 16, 17 months, also by the political and military leadership of the state, but also just in the public sphere in Israel, to outright genocidal language, right? It hasn't stopped.
I also want to add, to ask your thoughts. One of the last interviews that Biden gave before he left office, he said that he told Netanyahu that he can't, carpet bomb a population. To which Netanyahu, if I'm remembering correctly, he said that you did this in World War II.
I said, but Bibi, I said, you can't be carpet bombing these communities. And he said to me, well, you did it. You carpet bomb, not his exact words, but you carpet bomb Berlin. You dropped a nuclear weapon. You killed thousands of innocent people because you had to in order to win a war.
And a lot of people at the time were using that clip as some sort of additional indictment of Netanyahu's actions in the war.
Yeah, so I'll come back to this. I just want to, and this is a very important actually comment in the reference to bombings in World War II. But just to complete my argument about the evidence for genocide, by the 13th of October, right, with clear intent to destroy, right, with the carpet bombings, right, with the evacuation order that was clearly not, meant to protect Palestinians, but actually to enhance their targeting. It was clear, right, that we are actually seeing what's called, in the language of the UN Genocide Convention, the third crime, the third act of genocide, that is creating conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part, right? Total siege, carpet bombings, evacuation orders. Uh, uh, so it was clear to me that we're already seeing either a genocide that had started to unfold or that there's a clear danger of genocide. And it's important to remind everyone that the UN Genocide Convention is activated, right, when there is a clear danger. We don't have to actually have the evidence for genocide itself. We just have to be in the realm when there's a clear danger. And I think that explicit genocidal statements and the forms of violence that we saw in those first few days, right, were without a doubt clear indications that there's at least a real danger for genocide, right? Um, now, to go back to your comment now that you just asked about the reference to bombings during World War II. This is, in Netanyahu's mind, and in the minds of, I would say the vast majority of Israeli Jews today, right? They don't see Palestinians as Palestinians, right? One of the conditions we know historically, also from the Holocaust, for a genocidal attack on a group is dehumanization. And dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli politics and society and culture started well before 7th of October 2023, and of course, intensified significantly after 7th of October 2023. Human animals, Yoav Gallant that we mentioned, for example, but also the depiction, this weaponization of the Holocaust, right, and the depiction of Palestinians as Nazis. 7th of October basically as somehow, we jump from the Holocaust to 7th of October, right? There's nothing in between. 7th of October is some kind of continuation of the Holocaust, right? And then Palestinians become Nazis. Israeli Jews become defenseless Jews in the Holocaust. This is, of course, a world turned upside down. It's actually a world that Biden created for us when he visited Israel shortly after 7th of October, and in a speech created this exact weaponization, used exactly this weaponization of the Holocaust, right? And which, of course, then a nuclear power in a very powerful state, right, that has attacked for decades a defenseless population under occupation and siege, right, becomes powerless Jews, and Palestinians, therefore, they're in this kind of depiction become Nazis. This is important, and this reference to this exchange. I haven't seen that exchange, by the way, but if it happened in that way, as you said, it's not surprising because in the eyes of Israeli Jews and in Netanyahu's mind, Israel's attack on Gaza is outside the bounds of international law because it's a war against Nazis. It's a war against human animals. It's a war against barbarians, right? And it's important to understand that this also points us to the origins of international law, because international law, of course, emerged to regulate wars between civilized nations, that is, Europeans, and was never meant to apply to colonial warfare, that is, Europeans putting down indigenous uprisings and rebellions, right? Which is how Israeli Jews are understanding what's going on. So if there's a war against Nazis, and if in order to defeat the Nazis, everything was permissible, and indeed carpet bombings of German cities by the Allies, was part of defeating the Nazis, then it's also permissible. In this case, everything is actually permissible. There is no law in Israeli Jewish minds here, and in Netanyahu's eyes.
And is there a link to draw here between, you talked about the Holocaust, and, the Holocaust in history is quite unique, isn't it? The study of the Holocaust, it makes it quite a unique atrocity in history in general. But in a way, does it also kind of look at Israel as a state that is incapable of committing a genocide.
No, the Holocaust isn't unique, actually. It's-
No, but the perception of it, it makes
so,
it look like it is a unique atrocity,
we've
is what I'm
had,
trying to say.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, the public perception of the Holocaust as unique is very much alive. Absolutely. Even though we have, significant scholarship in Holocaust and genocide studies for at least 20 years now, that, shows clearly that the Holocaust was not unique. Now, it's important to say, any historical case and any case of genocide has specific elements, characteristics, right, within particular contexts and so on and so forth. In that sense, we can say that any case is unique, right? But of course, when we talk about Holocaust uniqueness, that's not the meaning of the word unique, right? I mean, this ties to the name of the field that I work in, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is a very strange title, right? I mean, if the Holocaust was a case of genocide, this title is bizarre.
Exactly. It's singling it out.
Exactly. So now we can go into, why the Holocaust is not unique and everything. And again, there's a lot of scholarship, but the point is that yes, in public perception, this idea persists that the Holocaust is unique, and it's also based on the idea that Jews are a unique people, actually. Now, this is well before, this idea that Jews are foundational in the Judeo-Christian, right, world and the Judeo-Christian civilization. Um, so, this enhances the idea that what happens to Jews is also somehow unique, including the Holocaust, of course. And then there's much more to say about the construction of the Holocaust as unique as a political project after World War II, both by the West, by the way, and by the Soviet Union. But the idea that Jews are unique and then the idea that the Holocaust is unique then definitely also means that Israel, the self-proclaimed Jewish state, right, the state where indeed a lot of Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, is also unique, right? So from the moment that Israel is created, right, there's this idea that, it is unimaginable that it can perpetrate really any crime under international law, let alone genocide, right? Because it's
And
this,
that was my question. Exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Now, that's also the origins of, this, widespread idea in Israel, certainly, but also in the West, that the Israeli army is somehow the most moral army in the world, right? Which is a very strange, I mean, it's a childish way to think about the
And
world
it's
around.
only Western governments that say it, really.
No, of course. I said a very dominant idea in Israel and the West, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, when we look at uh, you know, the idea that Israel is unique as well, this is the origins of impunity, basically, in international law for Israel, right? That Israel, it's an unimaginable and unspeakable that Israel can commit any crime under international law. That's why Israel could, I always say, think about the settler project, the post 1967 settler project, right? When we have today 900,000 Jews in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is a crude violation of international law, right? Black letter plain, right? You are not allowed to settle, an occupier is not allowed to settle their population in occupied territory, right? How can it go on for decades, right? Involving, of course, massive violence against Palestinians, dispossession of, and theft of land and resources, and of course, mass incarceration of Palestinians and violence and killings and deportations and so on and so forth. Um, how can it go on for decades with all of us witnessing and watching this, right? It wasn't hidden, right? Impunity, impunity for Israel. Now, I'm just referring here to us to your comment about the West, this idea, how this idea functions in the West. Um, the international legal system has not only failed, right, Palestinians for decades, and then has also failed them after October 2023, because again, we're, 16, 17 months of genocidal violence. Gaza is, the north of Gaza certainly is destroyed completely, but all of the Gaza Strip has been, destroyed. Um, but international legal system has not only uh, failed Palestinians, it has failed. We live in a world with more than 120 million forcibly displaced people, right? More than 120 million. The international legal system has failed dozens of millions of people, primarily in the global south. And that's the reason that we have uh, uh, so much support for the Palestinian cause, and it's certainly so much support for the Palestinian cause after October 2023 in the global south. And it's not by accident, of course, that it was a global south country, South Africa, that filed the case on genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Um, and the reason for that is not necessarily because of people in the global south know a lot about Palestine and Palestinians. Not necessarily because even it's at the center of their concern, right? Israel's attack on Gaza. And so, because they recognize here, because of the special status of Israel in this system, right? Because of the idea of the Holocaust as unique and Israel as unique, they recognize here an opportunity for, I would say, a radical transformation of the international legal system that has failed them for decades and decades and decades, right? This is why this is one of the reasons that we have so much support in the global South, or among global South people, even though, of course, this first ever live stream genocide, right, should touch anyone, right? I mean, the images that we've been seeing for 16, 17 months on our screen, right? The horrendous videos, thousands of videos that Israeli soldiers and officers have uploaded to social media documenting their war crimes, right? Should, shock anyone, right? Uh, um,
Which this takes me to my next question, Roz. And for the record, you've given me permission to call you Roz.
Absolutely.
Given everything you've said, we've talked about why you called it a genocide. Now, given everything you've said in support of that, why is it so easy to refute calling it a genocide or calling Gaza a genocide? What are people overlooking?
I don't think it's easy, actually. I think that what you have in many cases is actually not a successful, argument against the argument for genocide. And we also have to remind everyone that there's also, overwhelming evidence for war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, there's arrest warrants, active arrest warrants by the Criminal Court against Netanyahu and against Gallant, right? For war crimes and crimes against humanity, not genocide yet, but and in many cases, I think in the vast majority of cases, we haven't actually seen a successful counter argument, right? Because the evidence is so overwhelming. I mean, just take what I just mentioned, the thousands of videos of Israeli officers and soldiers documenting their own crime explicitly, right? This is, by the way, very important because they actually show us how they understand the intent to destroy Palestinians as such on the political and leadership level, how it actually does shape violence on the ground, right? And we need to show this actually when we talk about genocide, right? That the intent actually shapes the dynamics of violence on the ground. And we see this actually through these videos that Israeli Jews are willingly uploading to social media. They're doing this because, as I said, they don't recognize that this is within the bounds of international law at all. And they don't recognize that Palestinians are actually humans, deserving of rights, dignity, respect of international law, and so on and so forth. Now, uh, uh, so in that sense, we haven't seen um, a good counter argument. What we have seen is an insistence, right, an ideological insistence on the idea of Israel uniqueness. And we have seen, of course, a crude weaponization of Holocaust history and a crude weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right? To say that if you dare, for example, to raise the argument, right, that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza, then we don't have to engage with the evidence because it's anti-Semitism, right? And now this is a very powerful, of course, attack, right? The accusation of genocide. Now we're not talking about the evidence anymore. We're talking about whether you're an anti-Semite or not, right? That's what we're seeing primarily. I can't, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you've seen otherwise, but I have not seen a good argument against the overwhelming evidence, right, for genocide, but also for crimes against humanity and war crimes, in this case.
Yeah, no, it's not even what I was trying to get at. What I was trying to get with my question is that the debate isn't settled because you're saying that there is overwhelming evidence, yet it hasn't settled the debate. But I think you just answer it right now. It's because of this weaponization, which would take me, to another question is like, what is the biggest example that you would think of this weaponization of the Holocaust or anti-Semitism?
I mean, there's unfortunately
There's a lot, I know, yeah.
numerous examples. So this is again the weaponization, of the struggle against anti-Semitism did not begin on the 7th of October, 2023, right? Nothing began on the 7th of October, 2023. This weaponization really is an Israeli state project that emerged in the 1990s in order to make sure that critique of Israel could be addressed in a way that will not require actually engagement with any kind of evidence. For example, because the settler project was so, you know, open for all of us to see, right? Rather, it will be, silenced, and people will be intimidated not to criticize Israel. Now, why in the 1990s? Because in the 1990s, we see an emerging discourse about Israeli settler colonialism that is beyond. I mean, Palestinians have been writing about Israeli settler colonialism since the 50s, since the early 50s, right? So from the very beginning. In the 1990s, we see other people raising the settler colonial framework to discuss Israel and Israeli history and Israeli violence against Palestinians. We also see an emergence of discussions of settler colonialism in other places, in the US and Canada and Australia. Again, many people have been talking about settler colonialism in these cases before the 1990s. And in order to respond to this kind of new development, right, the Israel adopts, right, the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, specifically, as I said, as a way not to deal with evidence, right? Now, when I say the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, one key issue and then I think I'll note some key examples that you asked me, but one of the things to remind everyone here, which is very, very important, is that the struggle against anti-Semitism emerges in the late 19th century. At the moment that we have the emergence of modern anti-Semitism as a political movement in Germany, in the German Empire, in the late 19th century, and the struggle against anti-Semitism is meant to protect. The struggle is a struggle that Jews are engaged in together with people who support them, and it's meant to protect Jews, a people, from discriminatory and violent states, right? What does the weaponization do? It again also creates a world turned upside down, right? Now we're not talking about a people under attack by states. We are now protecting a state from criticism of its attack against the people, Palestinians, right? So now we're not talking about Jews anymore. We're talking about Israel. One of the side effects of this weaponization, of course, is that it actually puts Jews in more danger, right? Rather than protect Jews around the world, right? Because, for example, it feeds into this conflation of a people and a state, right? Now, Israel claims that basically the only way to be a Jew is to identify with Israel or to be a Zionist, right? So what is it true, this idea about double loyalty, right? This anti-Semitic idea that Jews are not loyal really to wherever they are, right? They're loyal to Israel. This enhances this anti-Semitic idea. It also enhances an anti-Semitic idea that Jews have somehow special access to power, because why are we singling out anti-Semitism? Why in the US aren't we talking about, you know, anti-Black racism in this kind of way, right? Which is arguably much more significant in US history, right? You can say. So
Is this why you've said the project of Israel as a security project for Jews has failed, not only in Israel, but all over the world?
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the uh, uh, Israel is not a project that has managed to, to deliver on the promise of security, this kind of post-Holocaust security for Jews that was framed, by the way, in the same way that led to the Holocaust. That is the exclusionary nation state, right? Why were Jews, part of the way in which Jews were targeted during World War II and the Holocaust throughout Europe is through the nation state framework, the exclusionary nation state framework, right? The only people who really belong in the nation state, it could be the Hungarian nation state, the Romanian nation state, the German nation state, and so on and so forth, are the people defined as German, Hungarian, Romanian, etc., in the eyes of the state, right? And of course, Jews were not part of that construction, and others were not. We can think about Roma, by the way, right, which is a very important issue, but deserves a separate discussion. But after the Holocaust, we took this construct of the exclusionary nation state, which was part of the problem, and reproduced it, right, in the Israeli nation state, adding to it, of course, a layer of the settler state, right? So Israel is at the intersection, actually, of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and the exclusionary nation state, right? All the things that were not good for Jews and actually led us to Nazism and the Holocaust. So, of course, it did not work, right? This idea about security and the exclusionary nation state, right? It doesn't work, by the way, for anyone, really, right? I mean, did the Nazi project work for Germans, right? Of course, it didn't work for the dozens of millions of victims of the Nazis, first and foremost Jews, but it also didn't work for Germans at the end of the war so well, I think, right? So, so yes, the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism enhances the insecurity of Jews around the world, right?
But isn't it ironic that you would be called an anti-Semite for saying something like that?
Oh, I mean, all of this is crazy, right? I mean, it's beyond ironic. It's really, really crazy, right? That and it's not just me. Think about it. We have Israeli Jewish scholars of the Holocaust and genocide. We can think about Omer Bartov. We can think about Amos Goldberg, and others, right? We can think about a lot of Jewish scholars, not only Israelis, right, who have talked about Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza and have been critical of Israeli crimes and mass violence and mass atrocities against Palestinians before October 2023, right? Barry Trachtenberg, for example, many others, right? So now we're in this crazy situation where Jews and Israeli Jews, right, who deal with the Holocaust, who study the Jewish world, who study genocide, right, many of them come from families with Holocaust survivors, right? Now these people are anti-Semites, right? Which of course they're not, right? But it's a very, very powerful attack because it also has, an effect that is, you might say, perhaps it's almost inevitable, certainly in the media kind of atmosphere in which we live, right? That then immediately the discussion is not about what they're saying about Israel and Israeli state violence, but about
It's about your Jewishness.
yeah, how are you Jewish? Are you maybe this is anti-Semitism, or I don't so so it's a very powerful mechanism and it has worked, right, for Israel in the international legal system and in the West since the 1990s, since the emergence of this weaponization, right? It hasn't worked so well in the global South, right? Again, if we remind everyone that the world doesn't, begin and end in the US or with the West, right? But now today we're seeing, an attack. So there's many individuals who are affected by this. This weaponization, first and foremost, of course, targets Palestinians, and it targets other Arabs, and it targets Muslims, who Palestinians or others who speak out about Israel and Palestine. Um, but it also more and more, increasingly more, targets Jews, right? And
And just to note, this attack here that we're talking about, it's attacking how you express your Jewish identity or how you express the way that you're an anti-Zionist Jewish man. It doesn't seem like the engagement is what you're saying or what you're writing.
no, no, not at all. I mean, that's what I'm saying, that it's a way not to engage with that wall, right? Now, uh, the paradigmatic case really of in the academic world. I mean, in the academic world where I work, right, this attack is particularly grotesque, right, because the academic world is supposed to be committed to documented reality, to research, to teaching, or, let's be kind of old school here first. I'll bring out my old school historian here for a second, right? Truth, right? Because in some cases, and I've said this before, right? It feels that, you're standing with someone outside in the middle of the day, right? And you're saying, it's the middle of the day, right? And they turn to you and they say, no, it's the middle of the night. And if you say that it's the middle of the day, you're an anti-Semite, right? That's how it feels. I mean, it's so absurd, it's so grotesque. And in the academic world, I mean, the paradigmatic uh, case, an awful case of attacking an anti-Zionist Jew for her critique of Israel and Israeli genocide in Gaza is, of course, Mara Finkelstein, who the tenured faculty member was fired, right? So this is also, so it's not just, I mean, we have hundreds, if not more, cases of people who are adjunct, right, in adjunct positions who their positions were not renewed or they were fired or in other ways removed, right? But Mara Finkelstein is a case where a tenured faculty member was fired, and no less because if I'm not mistaken, because she liked a post on social media, right? Um, so, and this idea, and it signals to us, uh, the that this is indeed so challenging, right? And this is in a U.S. university, a U.S. college, right? And we might ask, why is a discussion about a different country, Israel, right, so challenging in the U.S. academic framework? Right. Now, of course, I've been attacked as well, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar has happened to you too. With the
Not
University of
in
Minnesota,
Minnesota. Yeah, not similar. I mean, I was offered I have
or a
my
job offer was rescinded. Yes.
yeah, I haven't lost my job. I think in Mara Finkelstein case, and this is why it's so significant because it points to what's, to the new normal, as it were, right? That tenure, and of course, this isn't a broader attack against the academic world that's been going on for a couple decades at least now, including an attack on this system of tenure right? So there's a broader issue here about the academic world that the issue of Palestine fits into. But what the case of Mara Finkelstein signifies is that, nothing protects you now. If you will express your anti-Zionism, right, even if you're a Jew, and even if the evidence that you base what you're saying on is very strong, right, you might lose your job even if you have tenure in the academic world. Now, I have a tenured position at Stockton University in New Jersey, where I have so far, had support on my campus, right? And that's significant. But I was offered a position to head the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. And it was together with a tenured position, associate professor of history in the history department. And both of these, the academic position and the position to head the center, were withdrawn within days back in June 2024, following a coordinated attack against me by the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Minnesota and the Dakotas, which really is today an organization that is much less concerned with Jews in the Minnesota and the Dakotas and much more functions as an Israeli advocacy group, basically, right?
Let me just read what they said about when the university was offering you the position. I mean, they released this statement, which I'm sure you've read back then, in June 9th, 24. They said that the University of Minnesota is planning to hire a prominent anti-Zionist professor, Ross Siegel, to be the next director of its Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Outrageously, Siegel accused Israel of genocide on October 13th, 2023. His debunked extremist views include calling Israel a settler colonial power and dismissing concerns about campus anti-Semitism. This person is plainly unfit to lead this venerable Minnesota institution. Technically, this appointment can still be blocked, but it will require a massive outcry from the community to university leadership expressing our outrage of the weaponization of Holocaust studies against Israel and the Jewish people. Now, just even hearing that back,
I mean, it's the level of craziness is really so there's a number of things there to unpack, right? So let's start, and we'll see where we get. One is, of course, the fact that anti-Zionism is an illegitimate, right, position. It's really anti-Semitism, right? So, this kind of position that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is so ridiculous because, of course, it completely erases the fact that anti-Zionism emerged in the Jewish world with Zionism, right? And it was a form of Jews expressing their Jewish identity, right? And there were many anti-Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jewish organizations and anti-Zionist Jewish political parties. And there are still today anti-Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jewish organizations and an integral part of the Jewish world, right? And to say that this is now somehow anti-Semitism is just crazy and grotesque and false, right? Completely, right? There's just, we have to be clear. There's no other way, there's no engaging in this absurd argument. Anti-Zionist Jews are not anti-Semites, right? Point. There's nothing else to say about this, right? People might be offended. People might be, feel that, these people are too extreme or whatever it is, right? And we can have a debate and we can discuss, and right? But they're not anti-Semites, anti-Zionist Jews, right? And that's just as clear as day, right? And these are people, again, a lot of anti-Zionist Jews are actually very much involved for a long, long time, right? In the real struggle against anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism in the United States, for example, is a very real issue. It's a very real issue. We actually have seen a spike in anti-Jewish violence in the U.S. since 2016. I wonder what happened then, right? In 2016, anti-Semitism has been a very real issue in the United States. Anti-Semitic violence has been a very real issue in the United States. It's still a very real issue. It's actually increasing. And many anti-Zionist Jews, much more than the people who attack them, actually, in many cases, have been very involved in the struggle against this, right? So this is a crude, a crazy allegation that we need to address in this way. We need to dismiss it, right? There's no way I mean, engaging with it is already giving it a certain level of validation.
But even the dangers of the dangers of a group like this interfering in the hiring process of a public university.
Mm-hmm. No, this is so, I think that what happened in the University of Minnesota is that following the rescinding of my offer, faculty in the College of Liberal Arts, but actually across the university, um, a majority of faculty, actually, there was a no confidence vote in both the interim president, Ettinger, who withdrew my offer, and in the provost. And there was a no confidence vote in the College of Liberal Arts, but also in the entire university. So a majority of faculty in the university voted no confidence in the interim president, who actually left shortly thereafter. In any case, he was interim, and in the provost, and many of the faculty members in the University of Minnesota were up in arms about this. Not all of them at all actually supported my position, right, on Israel's attack on Gaza as genocide, for example, right? But many of them said that this is extremely dangerous, right? Because clearly I'm speaking from a professional perspective, right? Actually, this is a very clear First Amendment issue, right? Involves free speech, but also academic freedom. And they said, well, if a job offer could be withdrawn in this way, and by the way, no one at any point in the process raised any concerns about my professional and academic qualifications, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was only about what I said and wrote on Gaza. And the faculty in the university said, well, if the university can do this, this could be a precedent, and they could do it. It opens the door for any pressure group, right, on any issue, right?
Sure.
Extremely dangerous. And again, part of a larger attack against the academic world that's been going on for quite a long time in the United States and in other places. So there's of course this this issue. But I want to go back to what you read to me, right? That the
Yeah,
J.C.
please.
Wrote about me. Now, think about one of the things that they wrote, that they said, how dare this person talk about Israeli settler colonialism, right? Which is a reality in front of our eyes. That even just if we just consider the post 1967 settler movement and settler reality, right, of nearly 1 million Jews now in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, right? And also, if we consider the discourse in Israel after October 2023, that is, the settler discourse about Gaza, right? That this is an opportunity now, right, to settle again in Gaza, right? To destroy Palestinians and, right, to destroy, in October 2024, we had a big gathering of settler leaders just outside of Gaza. There were also actually government ministers, because of course the Israeli government today is controlled by settlers, right? Ben Gvir and Smotrich, right? These are explicit settler leaders. So there were settler leaders, there were government ministers, there were lawmakers, right?
As always, thank you for watching. I'm Mark Hage, and we'll see you soon again, I hope, on the Vermont Report on Palestine, Israel.